Absolutely. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to this city diplomacy event organized by the Geneva Cities Hub and in partnership with the Geneva Environment Network. So for those who don't know us yet, the Geneva Cities Hub is a platform that has been created by the city of Geneva, the Canton of Geneva, with the support of the Swiss federal authorities to support the enhanced engagement of cities, local, regional governments in multilateralism. So the focus of today's event will be on COP26. As you all know, the world converged last month in Glasgow for the COP26 on climate change, which resulted in the adoption of the Glasgow Climate Pact. We've heard about it in the news, you heard about the progress, you heard about the disappointments as well, and what it meant for the 1.5 degree ambition. So today we'll talk about the COP26 from the very narrow perspective of one of the major groups of stakeholders, that is cities and local and regional governments. Numerous cities have been very vocal in relation to climate change at the international level, in particular since the Paris Agreements. And while cities constitute the principal emitters of greenhouse gas, they also are the ones who are significantly impacted by climate change. Hence their strong mobilization at the international level to be heard, to provide their own perspective, to share their local solution and local challenges. So the objective of today's event is to see how cities have concretely translated their international engagement on climate change during the COP26, and in particular during the intergovernmental negotiation that took place in Glasgow. So we've got a great panel today with us, with 4 speakers who will share their views of international city networks, of city, and also of a multilateral diplomacy expert. Each of the speakers will have 7 minutes each. I'll be the timekeeper, and I might interrupt you in the interest of the discussion, just to make sure that we leave enough space for interaction with the audience. So I apologize in advance, but I might be a bit rude. So we'll start, without further ado, we'll start with Yunus Arikan, who's here with us today. Thank you so much. So you're the Director of Global Advocacy at ICLEI, which is a network of more than 2,500 local and regional governments committed to building sustainable cities, sustainable towns, and sustainable regions for all. You've been working in the areas of the environment and climate change in general for many years, for many institutions, and you acted in particular as a focal point for the local governments and municipal authorities constituency to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the famous UNCCC. So, Yunus, I'll ask you 2 sets of questions. The first one, I'd like you to help us set the scene about local and regional governments at the COP26. How many were there? What was the status? What kind of access did they have, in particular to the negotiations? What was the coordination role of ICLEI? And how do you engage, basically, local and regional governments in such a complex multilateral process? And the second question, I'd like to know from you, what did local and regional governments want from COP26 in terms of negotiated outcome, and what did they get? And there you go, you've got 7 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. First of all, I'd like to thank you also for the kind invitation and congratulate Geneva Cities Hub for this initiative and bringing us together. We look forward to continuing this dialogue with you as also a new partner in our process of the community or the family of the constituency of LGMA, as you mentioned. And I'm very happy to see my colleagues Agathe and Angus Miller, and I look forward to welcoming Ambassador de Alba after a long time. So let's recap. The UN climate negotiations was started in '95, and when this was kicked off, we were one of the three groups in the process: business community, environmental groups, and local governments. So that was that is still one of our strengths, that we are in this process, at least try to influence the process since the beginning. But the sad reality was that until the Paris Agreement, we were not engaged as a partner as such. The UN climate negotiations or UN climate framework and the Kyoto Protocol did not recognize us as in the text. So in the process of the negotiations, we contribute by preparing interventions, by submitting our documents, hosting our side events, or hosting sessions or summits of local and regional governments. And every COP is a unique COP because the priorities of the presidency is different, the political agenda is different, and the conditions that we gather, the host city, the host region is different. So we have had this at its best in Glasgow until even a couple of weeks before, there were still questions whether any of us will be able to travel. So this was, of course, one of the biggest challenges. Despite all, I can report you that globally, we have noticed that we have more than 400 local and regional government representatives across the world attending, and there's even more because during the sessions most of them were hybrid, so we were able to connect even virtually. One example, Australian citizens were not allowed to travel, but they were connected to many of our events as well at the same time. So 400 is not small, because if they were all in one delegation, they would be number 2. But we tried to make sure that lack of presence in COP is not a barrier, so that we make sure. So in the engagement, we had 2 ways of engagement: the blue zone, the negotiations area, and the green zone. And in this case, green zone was even expanded. We had UK green zone, Glasgow zone, Edinburgh zone. So it was more than 200 events that we were engaged, from city council or city hall, city chambers of Glasgow, up to Edinburgh Parliament, the Scottish Parliament in Edinburgh. So what we could say as well in that sense, that for us, the Blue Zone, the Multi-Level Action Pavilion, was our home for subnationals. That gave us the opportunity that we had our daily briefings. We had hosted numerous events with Scottish government and numerous partners, so that while we attend different events of the UN negotiations, we also kept our own autonomy. We are able to speak freely about our positions and our wish lists, so that it was a space for us that is safe. Maybe this was a response to your first question. The second part, and I'm happy to discuss in details in the Q&A session, but through this opportunity, I would like to commend all our partners who supported this massive mobilization. It was really a family way. It's a community that we have all got through together. In terms of what did we ask from COP and what did we achieve, we had our first day on the 31st of October. That was remarkable opportunity and coincidence, because it was World Cities Day. For the first time, a COP started on World Cities Day, and we had our press conference. We said that time for multi-level action is now. So it's not just opening 2 weeks, but we said that over the time since Paris Agreement, many of the national governments from North and South, from Japan to Rwanda, from US to Dominican Republic, have elevated their ambition when they worked with local and regional governments. And we want this to be enshrined into the second phase of the Paris Agreement, because we had been recognized in the preamble, but it has to come into practice. So we have been asking the notion of multi-level collaboration to be embraced in the outcome documents. And we had other process, especially on finance and just transition. But what we can proudly say, the Glasgow Climate Pact now, preamble, it says the last paragraph, we highlight the urgent need for multi-level and cooperative action. That is our biggest achievement. Let me underline, it's important because it is a word that is like opening a window for us, that it is now time for us to squeeze in. Just one example, the flexibility mechanisms of the Kyoto Protocol in '97, it was just one sentence there. So the CDMs and all this joint implementation, emissions trading, all evolve from this one sentence. So our hope that COP26, Glasgow Climate Pact, embracing multi-level with a strong narrative would give us now time to implement multi-level action. So we also have achieved recognition of our constituencies in the text. There's numerous, especially on the text on regarding Glasgow work program for action for climate empowerment and others. And we are also have some space to build on the Article 6, which is we are hoping that we can build on, especially on non-market approach to position sustainable urbanization as a new non-market approach. So maybe I can finish here if my time is enough for that first round. You're mute.
Yes, thank you so much, Yunus, and you were absolutely perfect. 7 minutes, all good. Thank you so much. I hope we have time during the Q&A session to come back to what you just said about what you got and the recognition that local and regional governments got. Let me now turn to Embajador Luis Alfonso de Alba. I can see you there. Thank you so much. I know it's early, relatively early in Mexico. Embajador de Alba, I'm not sure I need to introduce you, but still. Over the course of your career, you've been participating to many complex multilateral processes and even sometimes leading them, in particular the establishment of the Human Rights Council here in Geneva. And it was not the easiest one. And back in 2019, you were appointed by the UN Secretary General as the special envoy for the Climate Action Summit, which paved the way for the COP25 in Madrid and the COP26, of course, in Glasgow. So you were also, I've learned, a special envoy of your own country, Mexico, for climate. And in short, you're a multilateral expert, basically, who took part in several COPs. But you are today really speaking in your personal capacity and sharing your own views. So let me ask you a few questions. At the time of the Climate Action Summit back in 2019, you put a lot of emphasis on non-state actors and their leadership in fighting climate change, including through partnership with states. Youth and the private sector were very much in the limelight, and in my view, I think they were also very much in the limelight here, back in Glasgow in November. So two sets of questions here for you to reflect on. Tell us more about cities and local and regional governments more generally. Were they active back in 2019? Did you engage with them? Have you seen an evolution from the Climate Action Summit in 2019 to the Glasgow COP this year? That's for the first question. And the second question is more general. What is your view in terms of participation of cities in multilateral negotiations? What should be their role? What opportunities and challenges do you see for them and for states, basically? Thank you. It's always yours.
Thank you very much. And first of all, my apologies because I joined as a citizen, a public. I was not able to interact, but I was listening to you almost from the very beginning. But it is a pleasure to be with you, and it's a pleasure to see Yunus and other friends. Let me start by telling you that for the summit, the question you asked to me for the 2019 summit, cities were very much one of the main priorities we had since the beginning. As you probably remember, we organized a number of coalitions, and one of them was specifically focused on cities and what the contribution of not only cities, local governments included could do. And let me tell you that we came to that conclusion not only because of the recognition of the contribution that local governments do in general, but particularly looking into the future. The future is very much for these local authorities to engage much more. And the multilateral system is not appropriate. It has not the right incentives, opportunities levels of participation that are required. So we use this summit to open that space, to go beyond the rules and procedures and the traditional obstacles like registration and the status of observers, etc. And we organize these coalitions on equal footing between federal governments, local authorities, private sector, youth, indigenous people, women, etc. All the constituencies that need to be part of the process. The multilateral process itself, the COPs, are very obsolete, absolutely ridiculous, to be very honest, because you cannot have a mayor of whether it is a small, medium, or a large city, or a governor of a state, being treated as an observer during a conference. In some cases, they have responsibilities in terms of reducing emissions and adapting, which are huge, bigger than many other countries. So it is a little bit absurd the way in which local authorities are treated during the COPs. And through the summit, we were able to have a different setting. They were all sitting in the same room at the same time, interacting, identifying the contributions of each one. I think since then, the way has improved, or the participation of cities has improved. Jonas was talking about Glasgow. I was not there, but I heard that there were quite a number of improvements, but much more needs to be done. And I don't see that work being done at the COP itself, at least not at the beginning. I think the work needs to be done around the COPs and in the COPs. And around the COPs means that cities should organize themselves, have their own meetings, have meetings with institutions, whether we are talking about negotiating directly with a donor country, or whether they're talking to an international organization that can provide assistance. They need to develop their own plans, whether we call it NDCs for local authorities or something else is not as relevant, as it is important for cities to have their own commitments and to start a process of competition between the local authorities, which is a positive competition, the same way government's supposed to do, by peer pressure, and at the same time being accountable of what they do or not, because in some cases we also need to be aware that some cities have a huge capacity that have not yet used to fight climate change. So there is a lot of things that can be done. And my recommendation is to work increasingly among the organizations that work with cities. ECLAIP is one of them, and C40. Coordination among those organizations is going to be critical, especially if we are aiming at having a common understanding what is going to be the way to report and to follow up on actions by local authorities. And then you have the question of incentives. I think incentives work very well for cities and local governments, while pressure works well with countries. Countries need to be pressured to deliver on their own commitments, their NDCs, and all the processes at the COPs, which is a minimum common denominator. But cities that are doing much more than the majority of them need to be recognized, and that's going to be a huge stimulus for them at the local level and first, and then at the global level. Then you asked me a little bit about the process itself, and I started already telling you that the COPs are quite a disaster. It's quite frustrating because it is the minimum common denominator, the one that prevails, because there is a very wrong interpretation of the rule of consensus, which is not even a rule because it has not been formally approved as a rule for the COPs, but the negotiators, which are mainly technicians rather than diplomats or politicians, have an interpretation that it is quite drastic and negative. Consensus can be built at the highest possible level. And that was the case. You mentioned the Human Rights Council. When we work on that, it was a consensus at the highest level because we needed consensus. It was quite important not to dismantle the system, but everybody had to be flexible and accept conditions that were not, or decisions that were not very easy for them, in exchange of having a major goal. In climate, it is the opposite. In climate, it's sufficient for one country to say no for a whole idea to be disregarded. This is ridiculous. It takes one country to block a decision of the COP, except in Cancun, because in Cancun, we did not accept that one country have that veto power. And if you remember, there was a complaint by the Bolivian delegation. They were not joining consensus. But we interpret that consensus was not unanimity, and we ruled that consensus should prevail. So changes are urgent in terms of the way things are moving. Let me just end, because I'm taking too much time, telling you that the future of negotiations on climate change begin with a recognition that we are not longer dealing with an environmental problem alone. This is a problem that requires from the head of state, different ministries, to local authorities, to different constituencies, non-governmental, the financial sector. So many actors which are critical for a successful outcome. We need to build institutions that deliver, that respond to that situation, and it's no longer the case of the COPs.
Thank you so much, Embajador de Alba. You've said a lot of things, and I hope the audience will react, in particular in terms of, COPs being somehow obsolete to move forward on the environmental negotiations. So we'll come back to that, hopefully. Let me now turn to Councillor Angus Miller, who is here with us. Thank you so much for taking the time in Glasgow. So you do represent the city of Glasgow today, which has been very successfully hosting COP26. At the local level, you currently chair the Environment, Sustainability and Carbon Reduction Committee of the Glasgow City Council. And you're involved in various projects aiming at creating a greener and more sustainable Glasgow, so very much into the topic. So Glasgow has not only been hosting the COP, it has also been very active during the conference itself. For instance, Glasgow was among the cities who met with the UN Secretary General during a meeting to recall the importance to include cities in the final negotiated outcome. And also, I've noticed at the end of COP26, Susan Aitken, who's the leader of the Glasgow City Council, tweeted, and I quote, and we can show you the tweet and share the screen so that you can all read. Susan Aitken said, Glasgow's influence on this COP has been tangible. Cities and local governments are now acknowledged by the UN as the drivers and deliverers of climate action. That is in no small part due to Glasgow's advocacy and the platform we provided for united city voices to be heard. So, Councillor Miller, Angus, tell us more about the influence of the city of Glasgow on such an important multilateral event like COP26. What are the incentives for a city like yours to engage in such a complex multilateral process? Are basically international debates not too abstract from the point of view of a local leader? That would be the first set of questions. And the second set of questions is about all the events that you held during the COP. You held a number of them at the Glasgow City Chambers in collaboration with C40, ICLEI, Eurocities, probably others as well. So let me be a little bit provocative here. So what for? What was the impact? What was the outcome, basically, of those events where you gathered a lot of mayors who were present for the COP? Floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me and for allowing me to participate in the discussion today. I think, first of all, what I would say is that when Glasgow was first identified as the host city of COP26, and it's I think it's more than 2 years ago now, because obviously with the cancellation in 2020, we were waiting quite a long time for the opportunity to materialise, but we recognised that it was a huge opportunity for the city. We're a city which has, pretty progressive and ambitious target on carbon reduction. We very much want to be seen within Scotland and the UK as leading that agenda, and indeed further afield. So we saw the opportunity to showcase the work that we were doing at a city level, as well as to use the opportunity of thousands of delegates and interested stakeholders coming to Glasgow and see what we could kind of get out of that. So part of what we set out to do was to elevate Glasgow's status as host city. And I think it's important just to note that, as far as I understand, isn't a formal designation. We were made very much aware, it was made clear to us that the UK government was the host government, the host state, and it could have been in a field in the middle of nowhere for all it really mattered to them. But we wanted to use the opportunity of it coming to Glasgow to really make the most out of that. And one of the stories that we were trying to tell was Glasgow's kind of story as a post-industrial city which has faced the challenges of deindustrialization and the imperative of a just transition, because our experience of economic transition has been an unjust one. So we felt that we were pretty emblematic of many cities and parts of the world that were going through that same journey, and we thought it was really important. We also knew the importance of to the city in terms of pure marketing ability of getting an agreement with Glasgow in the title. We were hoping and expecting a Glasgow agreement. The Glasgow Climate Pact is as good as any, so that was obviously important for the city. But we also wanted to develop further the collaborations and the relationships that we put in place with other cities, with international networks, some of which you've name-checked there, and to really put Glasgow on the map as a city with ambition. And obviously the other thing that we want to do is to shape in our own fairly indirect way COP and the outcome of COP itself. So really our role obviously is, as Ambassador de Alba has said, cities don't have a direct role at the negotiating table, but what we can do is set the mood, set the tone as far as possible, and that's very much what we sought to do through the various events and communications that we made. I think a lot of people who are maybe not familiar with COP or the processes will see it as purely being that kind of negotiating table, bilateral or rather, kind of multilateral process, and it very much is that. But for us as a host city, we wanted to take advantage of all of the events, conversations, discussions that take place around the around the central core discussions themselves, because we felt that there was a real opportunity to set some of the tone there, and to elevate some key messages. So the two key messages that we wanted to take into COP were one, what we termed the Glasgow Message, and this was adopted back in 2020 by the local government and municipal authorities constituency back in 2020, and that was really just around the increasingly salient idea of climate justice and social justice being hand in hand. That's exactly what we as a city have put at the forefront of our climate ambitions, and we found willing partners in other cities and local authorities to take that message forward on an international basis. And of course, as you've mentioned there, the other key message was the importance of cities as actors in driving this forward. I think we're all aware that COP was an opportunity for countries, for states, nation states to promise and to make targets. But ultimately it is supranational governments that are having to deliver, and cities are obviously a key driving force of that. Here in Scotland, well, I suppose here in the UK, we have national net zero targets of 2050. We know that in order to get there, Scotland's net zero targets of 2045 are going to have to be met. And in order to get to Scotland's 2045 targets, cities like Glasgow and Edinburgh, the capital of Scotland, are going to have to make our 2030 net zero targets if we're going to have any hope of kind of meeting those national targets, because cities have the capacity with their density and the ability to embrace technological or mass transit solutions, whatever, to move at a greater pace and scale. So we said about kind of using our role as host city and our relationship with the UK government and delegation to try and raise these points and make those points, and we had a positive relationship with the UK government. We also sought to work with the Scottish government, which it didn't have, again, a formal role within the COP process. It was made quite clear to them that it was a UK government project, but Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland, obviously made herself very, very visible and very engaged during the COP process, again using soft diplomacy to try and push some of the same messages that Glasgow were pushing. And most importantly, as you've mentioned there in the introduction, we used our convening power as a city to set up events, participate in events, and really set the tone of the conversation and move the conversation on. So you referenced there the host city zone within our city chambers, which was fantastic. Dozens of events, many a day, each day throughout COP26, and convening stakeholders locally, but also internationally, and of course other city leaders. And one of the key achievements that I think you'd already mentioned there was that meeting that was held with the leader of the council and other city leaders and the UN Secretary General, which really was an important opportunity for us to press home the importance of city level action and cities agency in tackling the climate emergency. And I think we'd like to think that in being able to convene that and push that and give Glasgow's weight to that message, we were able to help increase the salience of that and of course get the outcomes that I think Eunice mentioned earlier. There were other events that we held, for example, a number around climate financing with international stakeholders and leaders in that, the City's Climate Investment Commission, moving forward that conversation. That's very much something that we are keen to be involved in. And we also used it for our own purposes, trying to leverage in investment. We just published a green print for investment, as we call it, which is a kind of prospectus for transformational investment opportunities within the city and things like district heating, a cap over the city centre motorway, the highway that runs through the city centre, and a sustainable transport system called the Metro that we're working on with the Scottish Government. So we really wanted to take the opportunity to kind of attract investment from the private sector as well as the public sector into Glasgow. And we also used the opportunity to with our the Eurocities event that we held to launch our own Glasgow Green Deal, which is one of our key planks of kind of economic transformation as we tackle the climate crisis. So I think overall we used the opportunity to the best of our ability, and I think we helped shape the discussion, at least set the tone in some ways. And finally, the only thing I would just want to add is that we're very keen to stress that, in our view, Glasgow remains the host city until November, until Sharm takes over. So we are very keen to continue to engage at an international and intercity level as much as possible to continue to participate in the discussions going forward.
Thank you so much, Angus, for that. Super interesting. I think you did indeed use all the opportunities available and set the tone very nicely. And I'm speaking here from Geneva. We're also a host city for other international conferences, and I know how the tone and the atmosphere that you managed to basically imprint in an area are so indispensable to get basically a good outcome. So thanks a lot for that. And we also heard basically quite interestingly that Glasgow is also looking for partnerships, or at least collaboration with other cities basically on the issue of climate change. So that might be an interesting thing to put forward to other cities who might be listening to us today. Without further ado, I'm now turning to a last speaker, who's Agathe Cavicchioli, Agathe, you, the head of advocacy at C40, which is an international network of 97, at least that's what your website says, 97 world leading cities making up about a quarter of the global's economy output. So that's not a small network, I would say. Cities in your network collaborate to deliver the urgent action needed right now to confront the climate crisis. So very much, the emphasis is very much put on action, basically. And you've been very active as C40. We've seen you, we heard you, we read about C40 during the Glasgow COP. And especially with initiatives, several initiatives such as the Cities Race to Zero, for instance, which is a global campaign rallying non-state actors to act and halve the global emissions by 2030, so tomorrow, basically. So Yunus started the event by setting the scene about local and regional governments at COP26, what they wanted from the negotiated outcome and what they managed to get. In particular, this multi-level, action and collaborative action. It would be now interesting to know what else matters for members of your network, Agathe, in terms of outcome beyond the negotiated text. Because of course we have the Glasgow Climate Pact, but we also have a lot of other basically initiatives and maybe other soft, outcomes. So while intergovernmental negotiations will certainly continue to dominate future multilateral processes for the years to come, we also see an evolution of multilateral processes which tend to become much more inclusive towards non-state actors. And I think Ambassador de Alba mentioned that earlier during his intervention. And we tend to basically get away from negotiated region outcome to add other kinds of outcome. So tell us, what outcome matters for C40 apart from the negotiated text at COP26?
Thank you so much for your introduction, and thank you very much to the Geneva Cities Hub for having me today. Before I start, I really want to commend the other speakers that we've heard of today. Not least of all, I'd like to start Councillor Miller to thank you, and by extension, Council Leader Susan Aitken as well. I think the tweet shared very humbly summarizes the absolutely stellar role that the host city indeed played this year. Thank you as well to Ambassador de Alba for ever being a leader and a champion of cities. And of course, our dear friend Yunus for so admirably organizing and leading cities and local governments and to help to navigate the complex intergovernmental process. So it's very easy for me to come as the last speaker after their brilliant interventions. And so from C40's perspective, this year, we were particularly conscious of the risk of failure of COP26. We knew that going in, the NDCs that had been submitted to date or that were expected were insufficient to put us on a pathway to 1.5. And that's a risk we really needed to mitigate because we need everybody to remain involved and motivated into tackling the climate emergency. We cannot have a fragmented movement that has lost hope. So to counterbalance the COP26 possibly being perceived as failing or the possible ensuing public discontent, not to say anger, we wanted to focus on showing meaningful progress, as I like to say, in the real world, but as it is more often referred to as the real economy. So a big part of our strategy was to be able to demonstrate how cities are leading on delivering science-based action in high-impact sectors and contribute to putting us on a pathway to 1.5 through their actions, through the coalitions of partners that they work with, and eventually by inspiring nations, but also businesses and all other stakeholders to take similarly ambitious action. So to answer your question, beyond the role of observers that ICLEI has so admirably described, cities have a big role beyond the negotiating room. And what I want to refer to in particular is maybe something lesser known to the public, but the global climate agenda is very important. It takes its roots back to COP2019 in Lima, but it was then formalized in the Paris Agreement at COP21. And essentially what the Global Climate Action Agenda does is that it recognizes there are actors and there are efforts outside the negotiations that help advance the implementation of the Paris Agreement, even when you're not sitting as a party at the negotiation table. These efforts help through concrete action on the ground. And this is a space where cities in general are extremely active. There was even a role created to lead this effort outside the negotiations. For those of you familiar with it, it's called the High-Level Climate Champions. There are always 2 at a time, and this year we had Gonzalo Munoz from the Chilean presidency and Nigel Topping from the UK presidency. Interestingly, it's the first pair of champions that are both from civil society. They both have backgrounds in engineering, business, and network organizations. So I think they were really sensitive. And this is why they have so significantly elevated, in my view, the Global Climate Action Agenda this year. So it's an agenda that C40 heavily supported, along with our colleagues from ICLEI, the city of Glasgow, personally, and many others. And some of the big wins, some of the big achievements we were able to meet thanks to this agenda and thanks to the energy it inspires is firstly, of course, the city's race to zero. You've mentioned it. ICLEI, GCOM, who I believe is also on the line, UCLG, WRI, WWF, and CDP were our partners in crime in this fantastic project that in the end saw more than 1,000 cities commit to halving their emissions by 2030. Collectively, their potential for reduction is equivalent to the 5th largest economy in the world. So that, for example, maybe is a friendly type of competition or an incentive, as Ambassador de Alba mentioned, to come to the front of the stage and take these types of actions. We also had some progress in key sectors. We chose to focus on buildings and transport because we felt this is where we would have the most traction in this COP. You have to understand that a COP is the biggest global climate platform you can have, and the anticipation it creates in the community really gives us an opportunity to coalesce partners around shared goals. So on buildings, for example, this COP elevated cities in the built environment to the status of priority theme day. That may not be much, but it's very important for visibility to have a theme day, and it gives the opportunity to have policy dialogues with really high-level representatives, such as ministers, for example. There, amongst a few things, C40, for example, announced a Clean Construction Coalition with business partners from all along the value chain. We had cities committing to clean construction. On transport, we had 1 billion funding to roll out electric buses in Latin America announced as well. So big, tangible progress. And it's also a place for innovative leadership. And that'll probably be my last example. But at COP26 as well, the C40 and Mayors Migration Task Force released the Global Mayors Action Agenda on Climate and Migration. Now, we know climate-induced migration is a growing issue that desperately needs a home in the intergovernmental process. It needs attention and a framework. So again, we saw there cities, on the front line of this issue, pioneering a really inclusive, really ambitious agenda on climate migration, and laying out their vision of how we should handle this issue. It's a vision for inclusive climate action. It sets out clear recommendations, and it also issues some city practices and recommendations. So in a nutshell, what else matters in a really complex multilateral system like this is actually maybe pretty simple. Having a clear message. Ours is that we need to listen to the science and take science-based action. And then it's making clear and concrete contributions that demonstrate how, in our case, cities are tackling the climate emergency and improving lives and livelihoods. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot again for responding so clearly to my questions. And indeed, there's a lot out there that cities are doing. And I hope we'll have time to get back to that in the 15 minutes that remain, especially in the sense that you have a lot out there, but at some point you need recognition, you need formal acknowledgement in an outcome, basically, just to make sure that people remember that one and take that as a framework. But let's go back to that later. I would like to turn to the room. There are a handful of people who made the travel to Villarigo here in Geneva, and I just wanted to see whether some of them had questions or something to comment before I have. No? Is that the case? No. All right. I'll turn to the questions that have been raised on the chat. One is for Glasgow. Can Glasgow formulate lessons for cities to take away for COP27? Already a bit of a prospective question there. So Angus, I'll give you the floor later, and also want to take two questions at a time. Do local authorities have enough tools, resources in-house to proceed with the implementation of COP26 requirements? It's a good question. I think I've heard that basically cities go much further than states. So Angus first, and then if someone else wants to respond to the second question about in-house tools and resources.
Sure. So on the first question, I mean, I think Glasgow's experience, obviously we were in a fairly unique position as a host city, and I think there's a special convening power that comes with that. And I think future hosts, I think hosts in the past, as I understand it, have, used that position to varying degrees of effectiveness. And I think, I would hope that there's a bit of a model there, for how you can actually try and take ownership over the discussion within your area and within your city as part of, the privilege of hosting COP. I think the main thing for me, in terms of, kind of clear takeaways, is that there's the strength in numbers. Cities developing partnerships and relationships, and speaking with common voice, was really what I think, kind of stood out for me. And locally within Glasgow, as a kind of portfolio holder within the city, I've obviously been talking about many of these things, and other counterparts across the world have been talking about all of these messages, all the time in the course of their daily work. But actually, having the opportunity to kind of meet with and discuss and collectively assert the importance of cities and the kind of key messages around, for example, social and climate justice, I think that was absolutely key. So I would really say, I think there are real opportunities there for host cities to use their position to do similarly to what Glasgow's done, but potentially to go well beyond that as well. And for any cities to participate in kind of that collective dialogue and the sharing of information and ideas, with the furtherance of kind of common goals and objectives.
Thank you, Councillor Miller. And I think on that you can also very much rely on the coordinating role of ICLEI, who will help definitely cities better position themselves for the next COP. Now I have the second question, and I was wondering if someone wants to take the floor among the other panelists. I see a lot of nodding, but who wants to take the floor? Yunus, go ahead.
I'm sure Agatha also would like to contribute. The short answer is yes, no, and more. Yes and no, in the sense that, yes, they have a lot of things that they are already doing. No, in the sense that in order to reach our 2030 goals, we need more resources. And effectively, the scale of investments, the scale of the investments, both for mitigation and adaptation, especially you see the floods and fires and these droughts, you've seen it in Australia, US, Germany. These are beyond the capacities, the municipal budgets of the cities, but they know how to do this. They just want to call local and national and global community that if they can receive more legal capacities, more technical capacities, and more financial resources, they can do more. That's the essence of multi-level collaboration. And look at this, whole world now is divesting from fossil fuels, and cities were the ones who were kicking this off. Where will this money go? This should go to sustainable urbanization across the world. And it's not just for the developing countries of the South. Look at the situation in the US. They are talking about $2 trillion. And with this money, the cities and states could do a lot, but without this, they can definitely not meet these goals. And maybe when I say more, the example again in the Glasgow Climate Pact, there's a paragraph says that we urge nations and parties to engage youth in local decision-making. This is exactly what we are doing in the climate emergency. So one example from City of Bonn, the Fridays for Future positioning and motion for climate emergency, and then this turns into climate neutrality commitments of the City of Bonn through Bonn for Future process. Yes, we are already doing this. And the more they engage this into the negotiations, the nations can do it much better. And finally, the cities are doing more than what has been written there. The best example is Scotland loss and damage voluntary contribution. The loss and damage facility was dropped off, but Scotland, Wallonia has already committed to do this. So there are a lot of things that cities need from the nations, and there are a lot of things that nations can learn from cities as well.
And if I can just comment, I completely agree with Yunus. I just like to share two figures when asked these questions. Given the right competencies, technical abilities and funding, cities have the power to reduce 90% of their emissions. The types of actions needed to reduce emissions are all within the grasp of cities, granted, obviously, these three conditions. And the second example I like to give is a city like London, very complex, huge, large city, not Scandinavian. They have reduced their emissions by 30% compared to 2005. And we don't talk enough about these really hopeful figures that show that it is possible, but it's very difficult, of course.
Yes, indeed. That's why it's not happening entirely, I get, but I get your point. I'm turning now to Embajador de Alba. I have two more questions for you, if you allow me. And one is about, because you've been positioned here in Geneva, and I wanted to know from you, what can we do here in Geneva to help the process? Knowing that the process is kind of rotating between different cities, and it's not based either in New York, either in Geneva, but is there something that operational agencies can do here in Geneva? And then I want to, bounce back on what you said about cities moving ahead, being very progressive, being very efficient in terms of the fight against climate change. So there's a lot of things going on outside the COP, but at some point we need recognition and we need, something to basically acknowledge this. So how can we do that without, looking at the COPs which are somehow ineffective? Sorry, difficult questions for you.
Thank you very much, and difficult questions. Geneva, at least probably because of my own time, the time I pass in Geneva, has an advantage in my view, which is the dialogue between different actors, governmental and non-governmental. the diversity of institutions that are hosted in Geneva allows a number of interactions which are not easy to organize in New York. That would be the first point. The second point is that New York looks into climate change as still as a very technical issue, which should be dealt by the COP, by the people in Bonn, or eventually the people in Nairobi, because they have so many important political issues to solve. They don't pay so much attention. And in that sense, New York is still very weak in terms of participation. There is increased interest in some of the ambassadors and groups, but that's much more at the intergovernmental level. So Geneva could concentrate on the relationship between government. The question, let me go back a little bit with the question of cities, for instance. The main problem, I think it is the recognition of what cities are doing, certainly, but there is also a problem of dealing with cities as if they were equal. And they are not equal, not only in terms of capacity, but in terms of capacity, access, formalities. In some countries, cities cannot access international resources, for instance, cannot do it directly. So these kind of issues could be dealt with the support of people in Geneva and start trying to find how cities can be supported, whether it is by UNDP, whether it is by UNEP, or whether it is by a private foundation or investment. These kind of connections and trying to level the ground for the cities to be able to deliver. I met with many mayors which are really enthusiastic and committed, but they don't have the legal or financial or technical tools to do that. So this may be one of the areas in which you can use Geneva. You have the institutions there, you can communicate. ILO should be very much involved, just to give you an example. But I think that's the role. One of the biggest problems, I criticize already the COPs, but one of the biggest problems of the COPs is also being in Bonn, which, with all due respect, is a very isolated, nice city on which you see many experts on the environment, very few politicians, very few members of other ministries. It facilitates a technical approach to climate change, which is no longer valid. Climate change implies a modification of the way we produce, the way we consume, the way we live. And it can only be achieved by fully integrating different actors. It's not a question of recognition of the contribution of cities. It's not a question of the contribution or the importance of the participation of ministries of finance or ministries of economy or agriculture. They should be recognized as full actors, in some cases even more important than the ones that are sitting in the table, around the table. The ministries of the environment are the weakest ministries in general around the world. And they cannot take decisions on behalf of ministers of finance, just to give you an example. So we need to change that. Let me also go back to your second question. It was, sorry, I forgot. It was Geneva. Can you repeat the second question? And
thank you. Sorry, I think you did basically reply to both questions. The first one was about basically the role of international Geneva, and the second one was the formal recognition of what is being done by cities, basically. So I think you did reply to all the questions. And I see the clock.
Okay.
Thank you so much. I see the clock is ticking. It's we're coming to the end of our event. I only have one regret, that it's just too short, basically, to address all these very important questions with the very distinguished speakers. I think there's one message that we can retain from this event is really that, as you said, Embajador de Alba, climate change is not technical. It's about politics and high level politics. And therefore, I think we'll talk to our founders and see whether Geneva would be ready to have a COP in the future to make sure that we have diplomats around the table who are like multilateral experts dealing with negotiations. But thanks a lot to all speakers for sharing your views and debriefing about what happened at the COP26. We all heard that cities are way ahead in terms of contribution to climate change, and that they need to be supported, both with resources, financial resources, but also political support. So I hope, time is short until the next COP in Sharm el-Sheikh next year, but I hope that, we can all basically coalesce around different actors like C40 or ICLEI to basically support cities in furthering their contributions against climate change. So stay tuned. We'll continue to look at this very important discussion around climate change here at the Geneva Cities Hub, and thank you to everyone for following the event.